Victor Montagliani likes to talk about growing up tough in East Vancouver, a neighborhood where street smarts got you farther than book smarts. It's amazing how those skills and that attitude have come in handy in a world that couldn't be farther removed from East Van, the lofty heights of international soccer. As the president of CONCACAF, the federation that oversees the sport in North America and the Caribbean, an organization that was rife with corruption before he took over, as well as the vice president of the FIFA Council, that's who runs the global game, including the World Cup. Montagliani is the most important Canadian sports official since Dick Pound sat in the inner circle of the International Olympic Committee. Rising through the soccer ranks, which in Canada starts with volunteers organizing kids' leagues, he's shown an aptitude for making deals and getting things done, both in front of and behind the scenes. These are remarkable times to be a Canadian power broker in the world game. Montagliani's tenure has included both turmoil and triumph, unprecedented success on the pitch, and high drama off it. Soccer has never mattered more in this country. Our women's national team, the drone spying scandal aside, remains one of the best in the sport. Our men's team returned to the World Cup in 2022 and now seems on the verge of even bigger breakthroughs. We have our own men's and women's professional leagues for the first time in our history, the former funded through a controversial arrangement called Canada Soccer Business. And next year, we will play co-host to the World Cup, something unimaginable only a few years ago. You can connect the dots from just about all of that to Victor Montagliani, one way or another. And if you think he's risen about as far as a Canadian can go in a sport in which we've historically been little more than an afterthought, underestimate it at your own peril. I sat down with Victor in his hometown of Vancouver at the beautiful Fairmont Pacific Rim. Hey, Victor, this is thanks for doing this. Number one, it's great to be back in your town. I know you're all over you're a man of the world these days, right? Or a man of this part of the world, North America, the Caribbean, and Central America. But yeah, this is I love your city, love Vancouver. I'm looking across the road here. That was the media center for the 2010 Olympics across the road here.
That's right. It was the media center. Now it's our trade and convention center. The city is, especially on a day like today, it shows itself off pretty nice when it's sunny here.
Yeah, Vancouver in the springtime when you can see the mountains.
Yeah,
it's great. So again, thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
Boy, we got a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on. This is, we are at a remarkable moment in Canadian soccer history for sure. There's a lot of different things. But can we start off and just talk a little bit about kind of your career track and like kind of moving through the ranks of the Canadian soccer and eventually moving into international soccer. A lot of people come into this game because they played it. They volunteer at a certain point. They get involved with a club or they get involved with an association. You're unique in the fact that you've ended up, in the world level of the game. But what are your roots? How did you get into that kind of pipeline?
Yeah, you know what? In terms of the pipeline from the administration side, I kind of fell into it. Obviously, I was born into the game. Immigrant family, East Vancouver, Italian. Grew up, won the game. Was very popular. It's an immigrant game in Canada. I think it's become more mainstream in the last 20 years, which is good.
Yeah.
But I grew up playing at a club called Granby Legion as a youth, and then kind of went to the Vancouver Columbus, which was sort of a they call it semi-pro, but back in the day, it was a lot of players that played for the national team. Very good club, very successful club. And then kind of went on to university, and then sort of a cup of coffee at the in Europe, and then obviously also played for Canada with the futsal team, which is a great game, five-a-side indoor. It was kind of new that back then, but it was a great experience. But really, the game was always part of me, right? Whether it's my uncles in Italy that played at a professional level, my brother was a good player as well. My dad was an Inter Milan fan. I mean, he named my brother after his favorite player in Inter, Mazzola. That's my brother's middle name. So it was kind of hard for me not to, the ball was at my feet from the day I was born. So which is probably the very similar story to many people that grew up in immigrant Canada in the 60s.
It was a world. Canadian soccer was a world. Again, I think of it as of growing up. It was largely a world of immigrants and expats, right? Like if you think of I can even think of minor soccer.
More expats than immigrants, but yes.
Yes, you know what I mean? Yeah.
yes, absolutely. I mean, when I was elected president of Canada Soccer in 2012, I think I was the first non-expat, either when I say that, I'm talking about even French or English. I think there was only one other person that was actually born in Canada before I was, and the association was 100 years old. So to your point, right? Yeah. It took a long time, and it's a natural process. I understand why that our history is like that. Our history is like that in many areas. So, but I think obviously now it's become, I think, as I said, more mainstream. It's not so much. It still is the sport of the immigrant, but I think it's also the mainstream sport, and it's really professionalized. It's gone from, really an amateur sport, which it still is to some degree, but it's really in Canada, it's a professionalization of the game that's really been the story in the last, I would say, 20 years, 20 years.
Yeah, for sure. I always thought there was, I used to feel that there was a bit of a tension there between kind of the old school, as that transition was happening, as more people were coming to the game who didn't grow up in the shadow of the San Siro or something, right? There was a bit of a tension, I always thought, within those kind of soccer ranks between the old school. We've been doing this forever. I grew up with it. My family grew up with it. My grandfather, my great grandfather, and people who were newbies, who were just saying, "Hey, this is kind of fun," or maybe came to it from the participation world because every kid started playing soccer. Every kid in the country almost plays soccer, right?
Yeah, it was, and there was a bit of a tension because it was like, even if you played, if you say to people, "Yeah, I played in Canada. I played in whatever league that was probably at that time professional or semi-pro." Or even if you follow the national team, yeah, but my national team is, come on, that's not real soccer. There was always a bit of that. That's gone by the wayside a lot. But that's part of growing up, right? That's part of maturing as a game, which I think Canada is still doing. I think in the end, I think I always said that, one of the most important things for Canada soccer, or for Canadians in soccer, is that the shirt that has to be kind of next to your skin has to be the Canada jersey, right? You can put on top of that, you can put on your Manchester United jersey and Whitecaps jersey or whatever,
or England or Italy or
all right? That stuff, right? And I get that, and you go to streets in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal during the World Cup, you see it all happening, and that's great. And that's what makes the game great. But I think the jersey as a Canadian that has to be closest to your skin is the Maple Leaf.
That was a long time coming, though, man. Like
it was a long time.
You remember going to international, seeing Canada play in international, and the loyal cadre of Voyageurs down in one end, but the stadium could be whoever the visitor was, right?
Yeah, I was reminded of that actually last week when the Whitecaps sold out BC Place here for Mr. Messi.
Yeah.
The last time there was a sellout for a soccer match was Canada-Mexico, World Cup qualifying, for the 2014 World Cup, that sort of run. And it was the first time that we sold out a stadium, 54,000, that 45,000 were Canadians and only 10,000 Mexicans. That was kind of the tipping point because the team started to come, right? And you had a young Alfonso and all this kind of stuff, right? And it was coming, and you could see, you had the sort of, the success of TFC coming out of the MLS. You had obviously the Whitecaps and the impact at that time, and you started seeing the cultural shift. And so that was, to me, a tipping point of where there was more people wearing red than wearing whatever the other color was. But to your point, up until then, and that wasn't that long ago, we're talking 10 years ago, it was the other way, where, you go to a Canada game, and I talked to a lot of my peers and guys even older than me that put on the jersey. They would say, it's not a home game when you play against the Central Americans at home, or even the Caribbean. I mean, whether it's Jamaica or whatever. But now it's been about 10 years that's flipped.
Yeah, and I think that's why and obviously the qualifying campaign for Qatar and getting into that tournament and being part of I've covered World Cups going back to '94, and always kind of fantasized about what would it be like, to be in, like to actually have a team, our team, where you could wear the colors and support your own team rather than going to it and supporting your, your homeland where your parents came from, or picking a team kind of out of the hat and saying, okay, I'm gonna root for these guys. But that whole wave that led up to, and again, I know '86 happened, but it was a different world than '86.
Completely different world, and even the game being sort of now it's sort of omnipotent, as they say.
Yeah.
There goes my fourth language of English there. In the sense that, you can find it everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Back then, I mean, the games were on CBC and not every game.
No.
And so that kind of stuff. So it was a great accomplishment, but it was nothing close because of the power of media and the power of social media. And, in terms of the magical run leading up to Qatar, and it took the country by storm. And so, you can imagine what the next, this run will be, although we've already qualified. And then moving forward, I think the base is there for Canada to be at every World Cup in the near future.
So okay, I've sped forward here. I didn't mean to do that because I wanted to be more linear here, but I wanted to talk about that stuff. But so when you got the job with CSA as president of CSA, that was 2012, right?
2012, I was elected president of Canadian Soccer Association.
So in the fall of 2012, San Pedro Sula, Honduras 8, Canada 1.
That was my first game.
Yeah, a memorable game in like all the wrong ways. A low point though, right?
Yeah. So I was elected president, and that was my first game. And I walked out of that stadium, and I said to Peter,
"It's Montagliani."
I don't want, Montagliani. I don't want to swear on your podcast, but I said this will never happen again. I said we're going to completely change the national team program. And what I meant by that was, I'm talking about even the way we carried our equipment. We used to carry it in hockey bags when I first got there. And I'm like, what are we doing? And so we completely changed everything in the national team program. We wanted to make the experience for the players when they came in a 5-star experience. One of the reasons for hiring at that time a Spanish coach who was with Real Madrid was because he completely changed the dynamics of how you come in. It wasn't so much you train and then you take the afternoon off. It was, prepare, video. It was a job when you came to the national team program. It wasn't like, oh, it's fun, I'm going to play on the national team. So the mindset changed in the association of off the field and on the field, made it much more corporate. And I think that was a turning point for the program to go to the next level. And it takes time, right? But the foundation was laid. And ironically, we had done that a year earlier with the women's program. 2011, after the debacle of the Women's World Cup.
In Germany, yeah.
Correct. Exact same, because that was the time I took over, right? So we brought in John Herdman, change of culture, and we did the same on the men's program. We had to wait another year after the Honduras match.
Yeah, although I guess, one of the different, correct me if I'm wrong, but on the women's side, you had the players, right? It was the same players in 2012 who were there in 2011.
You were ahead of the curve from a performance standpoint.
Yes.
Absolutely. But you had the players on the men's side too, I think, to at least get to the Hex. But then things started changing. You started attracting players like Junior Ho that was convinced to come to play for Canada. Big coup, right?
Yep.
He was kind of the first real one.
Yeah, because I was going to say, we'd gone through that whole stretch. It's an interesting discussion about what happened between 86 and, say, 90, Gold Cup 90, right?
Yeah.
Between then and, 2012, because that was we were talking, I was talking to one of our guys here before we sat down. I was there in the middle of the day at a whole Owen Hargreaves thing, right? So Owen Hargreaves chooses not to, grew up in Calgary, went to Germany to play in the Bayern Academy, played for Bayern, could have played for Canada, chose to play for England, which I got to say was a decision at that moment was the right decision for him.
Yeah, I can't fault him.
No, but people were upset here.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the story that of course he wouldn't play for us because we're never going to a World Cup. This program is in a mess. There's no money. All of that stuff. That was what it felt like.
Yeah, and that's why the off field had to change, and that's why we had to sort of say, okay, you know what, we can't default that. Oh, we're amateur. We're this. No, you had to prove to the players that you were serious about the off field stuff. And when they came in, it was charter flights, all those things that are important to make players comfortable. And that, to me, because the talent was even there then. I mean, Julian de Guzman, De Rosario, Paul Solteri. It's not like we didn't have talent.
All guys playing in serious leagues, right?
Yeah, I mean, as good as the team is now, there's some players that I just mentioned there that could play on this team.
Yes.
Okay, in their prime, right? Yeah. So I think we've always had Thomas Rzyński.
Yeah.
Fantastic player, right? So,
but Thomas Rzyński, I interviewed Thomas Rzyński when he was playing in Belgium.
Yeah.
And he was completely alienated from the program.
I know. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And not only alienated, but his experience when he came in wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't.
I talked to the guys. I obviously I know the players were there, and that was part of my thing about, okay, I need to change that. I don't want players, when they leave their club, they got to feel the same way when they leave the CSA or when they leave the national team program, because they're playing at good clubs and obviously they're taken care of, and their experience when they came to the national team program wasn't the same. We needed to at least be at the same level, and if not more, right? And I think that started, back in 2012, and the players started feeling that, and little by little, and obviously, that grew, and obviously with the women's program, they were ahead of the curve in terms of being on the world stage, and that obviously tremendous success at the Olympics. Ironically, we haven't had the same at the World Cup, but hopefully that can change coming in 27, because I think to me, that's very important that our women's team does well at a World Cup. We haven't really had that, to be honest.
No, they haven't figured out that.
They haven't figured that one out, right?
No.
The Olympics, they seem to know it, pretty well. But the World Cup is still a bit of there's been a bit of a glass ceiling there that we need to break through. So, you know what? That was sort of the dynamics of the cultural change of the program.
Yeah.
That started, and now obviously, but the reality of football is, you're always going to have ups and downs, right? It's a reality of football. It doesn't matter. I mean, you see some of the biggest nations in the world. I mean, you look like a country of, where my parents are from, Italy. Not exactly been a great 8 years.
Feast or famine,
other
right?
than the anomaly of the Euro.
Of the Euros, yeah.
It's been tough.
Yeah.
Right.
And you've had teams, France won a World Cup in 98, crashed out in 02, came back and were in the final in 06, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that's the beauty about football, right?
Yeah. Now, how do you look? So there's a chicken and egg proposition, though, from a Canadian point of view. So you're trying to professionalize the program, do things the right way in little stuff, like what kind of bags they're carrying their equipment in.
Which is important.
But it's important, travel,
all that.
Let's do it. All that stuff costs money.
Yeah.
But if the program's not in front of mind for people or for sponsors, and it's not wildly successful, then it's hard to get the money.
Correct.
So how did that transition? How did you fund the professionalization of the men's program? Yeah,
so part of that was sort of doing things differently from it's not just about funding; it's also expenses.
Yeah.
Taking care of your expenses too, being more strategic with it, understanding what's important and what's not important. So on a balance sheet, there's two sides of that ledger, right? There's not just the top line; it's also the bottom line. So I had a very good general secretary who knew how to manage that. And expectations too, right? I mean, coaches want everything, right? I don't know one coach in the world that wouldn't want that. So it's improving it, but balancing it, and also the revenues. This is one of the reasons that our sort of international media rights got more significant, right?
Mm-hmm.
The domestic media rights is always a problem in this country, for obvious reasons, because we don't really have a domestic media right. And it's a challenge and something that is getting better with the introduction of digital platforms and all that. But back then, there was really it was a tundra. But we started picking up sponsorship, and the key to that was also getting the Women's World Cup, right? So events always help. So by getting the Women's World Cup and hosting the Women's World Cup, that attracted sponsors to the entire Canadian soccer ecosystem, and not just the women's program, but all of it. And so the same thing that I think 26 will do, right, is just attracts bigger names, bigger sponsors. They're more interested in youth programs and all that kind of stuff. And so that kind of started at the same time, right? Because we got the rights to host the Women's World Cup in 2011. And so it was kind of the start of this sort of opening the doors of the CSA, bringing in more sponsors, having more opportunities in certain markets, being much more efficient in terms of how we did business. And then in terms of, and then came, as I was leaving, it was important, I think, to put your flag down from a sovereignty standpoint with respect to a league. And I think that sort of was the start of more of the professionalization of the game in creating an industry of football in Canada, in creating jobs. I think the last number I heard is like there's over 400 jobs that are being created through that ecosystem, and now even more with the event of the women's league.
Just so since you alluded to the Canadian Premier League, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, but could you? I want you to explain to people the Canada soccer business, the CSB deal, and as it links to the Canadian Premier League, as it links to the World Cup bid. Because CSB especially has been obviously is a hot button for some folks. I'm not sure people fully understand the arrangement and why it happened and how it works. I think there have been times when the players have been a bit baffled, it seems, by some of the comments about what it is. You were there when that was getting done. So kind of explain CSB for people.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's very simple economics. It's called aggregation, right? And it's done everywhere in football. We're doing it at CONCACAF. UEFA does it. And it's the way to move forward. It's very difficult if you don't aggregate your assets to actually get forward. And the CSA had never done that. When I say CSA, I mean the Canadian soccer kind of family. We saw what happened in the U.S., very successful. They had done that. They created a thing called Strategic United Marketing between U.S. Soccer and MLS. And they had a 25-year run, which obviously built their league, had a and built the federation, and the federation, obviously, because the MLS was growing players, it was helping their national team program, and for us, it was very difficult to expect 3 MLS clubs in Canada to support an entire national team program. It's unrealistic, right? And there was 2 issues we were fighting. One was the naturalization of Canadians in the MLS, so they weren't playing as foreigners, which we got that done, thanks to Commissioner Garber and myself. So that helps the MLS clubs when the players come out of the academy. They can trade them, they can sell them, whatever. Yep. So that helped. And the other one was, aggregating our assets so that we can sort of use that to create an industry of football, right? Yeah, could you, in a one-off year, make a little bit more money as a federation? Maybe, if you have a successful year, like maybe a World Cup year. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that what's your job as a federation is to grow football, and the only way to grow football is really through the professionalization of it. The grassroots is the grassroots; they'll always be there. The federation can close their doors and walk out the door, and you can walk out here and we'll see grassroots football. That's what it is, right? It's just organized shinny at the end of the day. And then obviously the better players go on to a more professional track. So it was obvious, we had a transactional relationship with some agencies, and there wasn't a lot of money. We weren't getting any domestic media rights. In fact, we had to pay to put national team games on TV. Ironically, the same broadcasters that, would not give me a dime to watch Christine Sinclair and Atiba Hutchinson at the time, then want to criticize when we bring in a foreign media company, because we had to, and try to aggregate our assets to move forward. And so that was the premise of, in 2016, when we sort of sat down and tried to attract investors, which we did, sign an MOU. I left then right after that in early 2017, and obviously the people that follow me continue on with negotiating what's known now as a CSB. But the principles are really, it's a global principle. It's not rocket science. It's the only way a country like Canada can really grow the professional game. And the intent was also to start a women's league. Actually in the original MOU. Unfortunately, I think with COVID and all that, that kind of delayed it. But, I think kudos to somebody like Diana Matheson, who's now been a champion and, started the league, the Northern Super League. And, I think it'll do quite well. So I think, standing back when you look at it, I think Canada Soccer is notwithstanding some of the turbulence that's happened in the last few years with off-field issues, I think it's in a very good spot. And I think a lot of countries would trade places with Canada.
Yeah.
They have very good national teams, men and women, youth, 2 leagues, 3 MLS clubs, and, hosting the World Cup. I mean, I'm not sure it gets much better than that if you're a federation.
No,
right?
it's, I guess, and again, I'm perception versus reality, but the perception, I guess, was that the CSB, that there was kind of money left on the table. Although that's after Canada qualifies, after the men qualify for the World Cup.
I'm not, it's always, listen, every deal you ever do, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. And obviously, if you look at CONCACAF, I walked in, we were bankrupt, and now we're $1 billion confederation. I think I've seen a few deals in my life.
Mm-hmm.
There's not one deal you do where you go, oh, you know what? 5 years ago, I forgot about that, or I should have done that. That's the reality of doing business, right? And it all looks great in that 1 year, but there was 5 years where they weren't making any money. And the reality is, when they, my understanding is when they signed the CSB deal, they immediately made 3 times more money than the previous person was, or previous entity was given to them, because that was a transactional. But the great thing about aggregating and the way you do it with a league, like the Americans did, you're kind of investing in yourself, right? It's like you go from renting to like owning, because now you have a league. That's yours, right? I mean, yes, there's owners and all that, but that belongs to Canada, right? And those players are going to, eventually come through the system, and we've seen it.
Well, you've already capped a bunch of CPL guys, right?
And you've seen players that have started as CPL, and I've seen players even that started below that at League One.
Yeah.
CPL, MLS, Europe, national team. That's why you do what you do. And so I think that's been for me, a tremendous success story. And, my understanding is that they're having they're looking at how to modernize it or whatever. So, which is like every deal that anybody's ever done. I mean, they evolve, and you need to evolve, and see how can be more mutual beneficial.
Did the league, the establishment of as you say, part of this is that the CPL comes out of it the same way MLS came out of the '94 World Cup in the States. Is it like, does the CPL have to exist for that World Cup bid to succeed?
Well, that's the other element, right? We were so we had bid for the Women's World Cup, and then shortly thereafter, I was at dinner just on the block here with a guy by the name of Walter Seabear. Very famous in the Olympic circles, worked at FIFA, legend in this country, mentored to many, many people in the sports industry, and Peter. And I said, okay, guys, it's time to bid for the World Cup. And they're like, what? Yeah, it's time. And Walter agreed. But having to do that, we need to have some domestic football. So it did go hand in hand. And so we kind of were building both at the same time. I think if the CPL was officially put in the books, even though they didn't kick a ball till 18, in terms of just from a governance standpoint and being official members, I think in 2016 or 17, which was a year before we won the bid, right? Or launched the bid, and before we launched the bid. And so, it went hand in hand. And then obviously the bid was a story in itself in terms of, because originally it was a 32-team World Cup. Originally, we were going to go alone.
Yes. All 3 countries were going to go alone, right, at one point?
Yeah. I don't know if Mexico was ever, but the U.S. was.
Yeah.
But then U.S. lost, right? And we know, the fallout from that. The U.S. lost, and, I had they were going to go again alone, and I had a pretty frank discussion with my colleague at U.S. Soccer at the time, who's a very good friend of mine still. And I said, listen, here's your choice. You're going to lose again if you go alone. And he said to me, well, why is that? I said, well, you want the truth? I'm not sure people like you guys, right? That's just the reality of it, right? My language is a little bit more blue than that, and I said, but together, you got, I got the brains, you got the brawn, right? And so he thought about it for almost a year, actually, because this discussion was early. And he said, okay, you know what? And I said, well, I got one more for you. Why don't we bring the Mexicans in? And he says, you know what? Let's do it. So we launched it. I remember in April of 2017. And at that time, it was still 32 teams. And then I had a discussion with the FIFA president at the time, who was the still current FIFA president, Johnny, who wanted to expand the World Cup, and which wasn't going to be easy because I think a lot of the traditional countries, anytime there's a new idea, they're always kind of against it. But a lot of people, we hadn't expanded the World Cup in a long time. A lot of teams were getting better. There was a lot of investment in the game. Non-traditional footballing countries were now becoming traditional footballing countries. Panama's a great example of that in our confederation. It was a baseball country, and now it's a footballing country. And so you started seeing the growth of that. And so when you did the analysis, it was obvious that it was a good thing to do. And so then that came about with 48. So now we were bidding for a 48-team World Cup, which made our bidding much stronger, with 3 countries that have the history of putting on events like all 3 of us do. It made our bidding much stronger when there's a 48-team World Cup. And obviously we won it in June of 2018 in Moscow, and the rest is history.
Yeah, again, the idea of, I know when the original talk was that Canada's going to bid for the World Cup, period.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people are going, whoa.
Yeah, I have an article from the Toronto Star still on my desk where the person that wrote the article says I was a crazy man. It was the first thing I said when I was president of Canadian Soccer, and I still have that article. So I'll give him tickets to the World Cup. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's always good to. I've got a couple things I filed away myself,
Yeah,
so I understand I understand the motivation. But Canada's place, and again, you're in a very interesting place in terms to speak about it, because you are operating on that the CONCACAF level and on the FIFA level, and you're in those meetings and you're talking to those people. Canada, I would assume, had zero influence for decades in the world of global soccer. We were a non-entity, were we not? And politically within that world.
Yeah, Canada. I mean, I guess as humbly as I can say it, we were a nice place to visit. And from a footballing perspective, we were zero. We had a little respect with our women's team because they did pretty good, and we had a great player in sync. But that's about it. We had zero on the field, really. Part of that was too, and it was part of a speech I gave to the players when I first took over, that then culminated in another speech in 2022 in the dressing room after. But off the field was even lower than that. We had zero. I think back in the 80s, there was one Canadian who I think served a little bit at CONCACAF, but that was a different CONCACAF. But yeah, it was not.
But CONCACAF was dominated by either Americans or Mexicans or
Caribbean, Central Americans.
Yeah, not us.
No, we were non-entity.
Yeah,
and but the world changed, right? And and listen, it was funny because for me, football has been my life. It's been my obviously I've been driven by it in terms of making a difference in our country. But it was funny because it was kind of a backhanded compliment. At first I went, and then I said, okay, now I get it. One of my first meetings, I chaired the stakeholders committee at FIFA, and this was 2016. And the stakeholders committee is all the big leagues, EPL, Bundesliga, Serie A, all the big clubs, confederations. And when I'm chairing this meeting, it's all issues of football, or a transfer system, all this stuff. And I was chairing the meeting. And then after the meeting, the EPL guy and the Bundesliga guy come up to me and says, "We can't believe you're Canadian." I go, "Well, why is that?" "Well, we didn't think anybody from Canada knew anything about football." This is 2016. And at first my first knee-jerk reaction was, "Hey, that's pretty offensive." And then I went, "Okay, I get it." To your point, it might answer your question, right? So in some ways it's a compliment, but in some ways it shows that, in many ways we hadn't been on the world stage at any level. And now I think the beauty of it is we're on it on the pitch with both our men's and women's team and players that are, Jonathan David, Alfonso Davies, Stephen Eustachio, Alistair, all the guys. And then our women's team, obviously that's growing too, right? It's not just about one player. It's about now a lot of good players. They're playing in Europe. And so, it's kind of gone hand in hand a little bit. And so I think that's, I think for the game, that's a great thing.
You're comfortable, obviously, in the cut and thrust of this stuff, though, right? Because again, it's a political world, as we've been led to believe.
Yeah.
There's lots of intrigue around FIFA always about what's going on there. And you obviously you've done well there.
Yeah, I think there's two things that have helped me, right? Or three, maybe. One, I think having the ability to speak the languages, all of them, the official languages, that is, other than German, doesn't hurt. Communication is important at any level. So that hasn't helped. That hasn't hurt me. I also think, I have a football first philosophy. Anything I think of, I think of football first. Not about commerce, not about economics. That will come. That's helped me. And I think the third thing is where I was born, where I was raised. I was born in Vancouver, but I was born in East Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this many times, and sort of you learn pretty quick in that neighborhood where I grew up how to handle pretty complicated situations, let's say.
That's a great euphemism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the old adage, right? It's you learn your street smarts, and I can tell you there's many guys that I grew up with that probably could do what I do, because they have that ability to sniff things out, see what's around the corner. That's an asset I think you don't learn in school. You learn a lot of things in school, and I'm proud of my education, but that stuff you learn. You learn in the way you're raised, and we have a lot of neighborhoods in this country like that. It's not just where I grew up. You're from Toronto. I'm sure there's a few neighborhoods like that there.
I'm from Hamilton, pal.
Oh, are you?
I'm
sorry. Well, they might be even worse, isn't it?
There's a lot of neighborhoods like that.
Listen, I know that Canada has a reputation of being Canadian. We're always nice, but listen, I think a lot of Canadians I know are smart, cunning, and we don't get pushed around.
Yeah, and all that stuff comes in handy in this.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk a little more about the World Cup to come, almost a little over a year from now. But before that, I do want to touch on, again, I know it's not directly in your wheelhouse but it's been a bit of a tumultuous year for Canadian football, Canadian soccer. The drone thing, men's national team coach quitting before that, women's national team coach being dismissed because of the drone thing. John Herdman being connected back to the drone stuff and being, I forget what the official term was, but reprimanded essentially after he left.
Yeah.
And then the hiring of Jesse Marsch, which I think has been an incredible breath of fresh air and very exciting and very exciting. The team seems reinvigorated in a lot of ways, but as an observer of that, and as a Canadian, like, what were you thinking as that drone stuff played out, especially?
My initial reaction is it was a very stupid thing. Yeah, I mean, the essence of it is, what are you doing? And I honestly don't know what you really get out of it. I mean, there's the accessibility to stuff online and games and whatever is...
The risk-reward equation didn't make a lot of sense.
Didn't make a lot of sense. Like, I don't understand, why you would even do that. So it makes no sense. Listen, coaches are always looking for an edge. I get that.
Yep.
There's no coach in the world that doesn't look for an edge. We've had situations, even in our confederation, where coaches dress up in janitor outfits to sneak in. I've heard of those stories, right? But yeah, okay, I get that. But to me, it was just a clear act of stupidity, to be honest with you. And listen, they got caught. She was punished. Move on. I think the story, quite frankly, needs to end. I should have ended with the suspension of the people that were involved, and because I think the players deserve that. And it had nothing to do with the players. In fact, the players were tremendous in the Olympics and honestly played better in Paris than they did in Tokyo.
Yeah, I'd say you're right.
They were fantastic, and they deserved that. They're just like, okay, it happened, I think it just needs to move on. Part of that too is again, that's a cultural thing in football. And I don't mean the actual what they did. I think more, I noticed that the world media, there wasn't a story. It was not a story anywhere, only here. It was a story when it happened, and then once it happened, boom, suspension, it was over.
Yeah.
Here, almost I kept bringing it up, and I'm like, why you keep bringing it up? Like, it happened, it was dealt with, get on with it. How about talking about the game?
Yeah.
How about talking about the players? How about talking about, why we didn't win the gold versus Tokyo? Like all that analysis. And part of that is, I think, the evolution of, the media in this country in terms of having more people that know the game, understand the game. It's not there yet, right? There is a lot of media, more than it used to be, but I think that's our next evolution, I think, is to have more people in the C-suites and more people in broadcasting that are more football people than maybe puckheads, right?
Yeah. John Herdman leaves with a bit of a cloud. He sounds like a guy who's, I can't do this. I can't operate in this world anymore. I'm not getting enough support. There's a lot of kind of implied lack of support from
when he left the CSA.
When he left the men's team job.
Yeah.
And then there's a long stretch where I think there's a question. Okay, who are they going to hire? Who can they afford to hire? Can you bring in a world-class coach? Do they have the money to pay a world-class coach? Does the situation structurally in Canada is going to appeal to a world-class coach to come in here, even if he's just a hired gun for the World Cup? And then you end up with this a year ago, a little more, about exactly a year ago almost. You a very innovative solution to find a way to, with the MLS teams chipping in, to pay for Jesse Marsch, who looks from moment one looks like the right guy, and the team looks different under him. It's obviously a really rough stretch, and there was a letdown after Qatar, I think, emotionally for a lot of people, and maybe a feeling that things were backing up to rather than going forward, and to the point where now we're in a position. I think there's a great deal of optimism around the program again.
Yeah, listen, part of that is just the ups and downs of the game, right? You come off a World Cup, there's a natural down. Listen, I think in retrospect, this is, again, the maturing of a federation, right? So, should John even gone past the World Cup? That was probably a time to say, hey, thank you, move on, right? They didn't, and, whether it's, players start tuning you out, it's a natural process, right? And whether John doesn't have the commitment anymore, I don't know. They know those answers, I don't, but I'm just looking from afar. Mm-hmm. Probably natural break would have been right after the World Cup. And then move on. In terms of, then looking at it, coaches, yeah. And, the thing is, innovative, yes, but it's been done many, many times. In fact, a lot of federations don't have the money to pay. Very few do.
To pay these world-class guys.
Correct. Right? So what do? They bring in sponsors. They bring in maybe stakeholders, high net worth individuals, whatever. There's always some way that they can attract. I'm talking even top countries. I remember when Italy hired Antonio Conte. The Italian Federation didn't have the money to hire an Antonio Conte. What did they do? They did some deal with, I think it was Nike at the time or whatever. So that model is what's done in world football, right? Many, many times in countries that you would think would just have the cash to pay, but they don't, because some of these guys are demand. So I think what they did was a good thing. I think Jesse has been a breath of fresh air. He plays that sort of a gegenpress style, which I think suits our players. And what I was impressed too, he's learned too. Like, he can't always do that, right? And I think his first two friendlies, he learned that he goes, okay, we did it there, we can't do it here. I think it was against the Dutch, right? So listen, it's an evolution. He's starting to learn the players. He's obviously learning our country. And you know what? He's done well. Absolutely. Had a great run at Copa America. Nations League, I thought they did well, but games go either way. But I think this Gold Cup for the team and for Jesse is very, very important.
Chance to win something.
One, you got to start winning. Like, it's one thing about we got great players, we play good football, and I think the players know this. You got to put something in the trophy case, because now they've had a good run here of almost 5 years of being very good. You got to start putting, and I think the game against Mexico was a great example of that, where Mexico, traditionally a powerhouse, the last few years down, but you saw their pride, and you saw they know how to win, and they figured it out, and they won, right? That shows you when a country has that kind of pedigree, right? We're just starting to get that, but you got to put something in the trophy case to get to the next level, and I think they know that. I'm not saying anything they don't know, but it's also the last time they get to play in real official matches that mean something before the World Cup. Because after the Gold Cup, it's friendlies,
Yeah.
and they're great,
Yeah.
but they're friendlies.
And they didn't have a qualifying campaign. So
Correct. So this is where, tackles are a little harder, the intensity is a little harder or much harder than the friendly. Even friendlies against maybe a top nation. So I think they know that. It also simulates what you're going to do a year out. Whereas you come into camp, you have a group stage, you play 3 games at a trot, then hopefully you get out of the group and you go on to single knockouts, right? So it simulates the exact same thing you're going to do a year from our Gold Cup. So I think it's a very important opportunity. I know Jesse knows that.
Squad selection is going to be interesting, though, right? Because it's a tournament where, in a lot of circumstances, you say, well, you're going to be a little more experimental, right? You're going to bring in, and you got guys coming off the long European seasons and stuff, but if
it's any indication, I've already, heard from sort of, I guess, the two, I can tell you that the Central Americans, they're all bringing their first teams, Mexico and the U.S. too.
Okay.
Now, obviously, if guys are injured, like,
sure,
Fonzie's not playing, obviously, but I think it's because it's your last, you can experiment in friendlies too, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to experiment in an official competition where A, you can win something, and B, it simulates exactly what you do. Now, it's a 23-man roster. Could you have 1 or 2? Sure. But that core of, 20, 18 to 20 is going to be your core, subject to obviously injuries.
Well, and they have been, he has been bringing guys into the squad consistently. Yeah. He's taken a different look at some people, and he's gotten younger, and so I expect that will continue. But
sure, of course, and there'll be an element of that. Yeah. But listen, I knew of Jesse. I've gotten to know Jesse more. Yeah, Jesse wants to win.
Yeah. He's also a Canadian patriot, the most American guy who lives in Italy, who is the
he does live in Italy.
Most eloquent Canadian patriot of the
he does live in Italy,
God love him for that. Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit, but just to wrap up, talk a little bit about what's to come a year from now. So I covered the '94 World Cup, first World Cup I covered in the United States, and a watershed moment for the sport in North America, obviously. But that tournament, that was a foreign game being played in NFL football stadiums.
Yeah.
And people coming from all over the world. I remember I saw Brazil play Sweden at Pontiac, Michigan, and there were 30,000 people from Brazil and 20,000 from Sweden and 10,000 curious Americans, right? Kind of saying, what's this? Italy, Germany at Giant Stadium. Germany, Bulgaria, losing to Bulgaria at Giant Stadium in the knockout phase. Amazing atmosphere and everything, but it wasn't. It did feel like something that had come from somewhere else. And then you have a league born of that, MLS, which people were skeptical about because of other leagues that had failed. But subsequent World Cups, American teams in World Cups, you'd be with American traveling supporters in World Cups. I was among them. 06 in Germany, like 02, it became an American game. Or Americans. There was an American. And again, I know there was an American soccer culture before that, going back, to what, the World Cup 1950, right? Yeah. So, and same as here. But that was something changed there. Like there was a sea change there. And if you think now of not just domestic football, domestic soccer, but the people who follow the Premier League or follow Serie A or watch the Champions League, the soccer literacy. To go with all of the soccer participation stuff with kids, which has been around for 40 years. Like we're in a spot now where when this hits this time, you're on a continent where people know the game. They know the nuances of the game. They probably played the game at some level. They follow it internationally. And in this country, again, we're way further ahead here now than the Americans were in '94 in terms of where the sport is. What happens when you drop the biggest sporting event on earth into this country in that moment?
Well, I think part of your question is also is part of the answer. In '94 was their game.
Yep.
Now it's our game. and ours being that we're part of the global game, a significant part of it, from an economic standpoint, from a player development standpoint, from a social standpoint. It is our game. To your point, we're not, what we were in '94 or even in '86. It is our game. It's consumed tremendously on this continent. And so now when we play in NFL stadiums, it's only because the stadiums that we use for football are not big enough. And to your point, I think it will be another sea change, though, but it'll be in the sense of this is the way I look at it. '94, it built the hardware of the game. The MLS came out, soccer-specific stadiums. That was the hardware that was lacking. 26 will build the software. Because what that will do is it will create more consumers of football. It will turn people on to the game at their local level. And so it will create another generation of consumers. So now what I hope and what I think will happen is that the discussions I used to have on my kitchen table were about soccer with my father and even my mother, actually, because I was an immigrant, right? And that's all we knew. And sometimes the Habs, because my dad was a big Habs fan. But I think a lot of kitchen tables in Canada, it wasn't about my game.
Nope.
It was about another game.
Yep.
In the U.S., the same. I think that's where the software will come in. I think the discussion at the kitchen table in America and in Canada will be a lot more about soccer than any other sport. Even though the father or the mother might not have grown up with it, but now the kid's going, I play. I just saw that. I want to talk about that. And that's the road I want to take. That will happen, right? And so I'm not sure that happened a lot in '94. It happened a little bit, but again, it was somebody else's game, but now this is our game. And I can go play for that club, and I can go be a professional. I can go work in the game at whatever level I want and find my way. That was difficult. That wasn't really a legacy of '94, right? This will be a legacy of 26.
Yeah, and I like, just to loop back, that's also why I think having the CPL and having the Northern Super League, where that you can go out and say, okay, I can watch whatever I watch globally on television, or I can watch the three MLS teams. But I can also go out to my local and wear a scarf and sit with the supporters and be part of this. Like, it's like you say, it's mine. Yeah. It's in my hometown, right? So that's a huge thing. The other thing, like Victor, you know what's coming, and I do know what's coming in terms of the event. To start this off, I referenced 2010, the Olympics here, which I think the biggest sporting event in Canadian history to this point. Probably the 2010 Vancouver Whistler Olympics, I would say. I know we had the Summer Games in '76; they're bigger, but that was huge, right?
And that was a long time ago.
Yeah. It feels like yesterday for me, but yes, the World Cup is a whole other scale than the Olympics, and I've covered lots of both. And people come from all over the world; they will descend upon us. To watch a sport that is their pulse. Not just something that they might drop by to watch because it's in the Olympics. Do you have a sense of what it's going to be like here in Vancouver, what it's going to be like in Toronto, and not just there, what it's going to be like in all the watch parties and whatever else is happening in places where they're not host cities?
Yeah, the Olympics. Obviously, my city. I was here. The Olympics is about a city. You said Vancouver 2010. Yep. You didn't say Canada.
Yep.
World Cup's about your country. It's a big difference. Yes, you have host cities. In the U.S., we have 11. Here we have 2. Mexico, you have 3. But it's about your country. That's the biggest difference between the two events, which it's a bigger scale, right? It's a much bigger scale, whether it's economic impact and, all that kind of stuff. So the numbers numerically are massive. TV audiences, let's not even go there because, our TV audiences will dwarfs the Super Bowl. So you imagine the Olympics, right? So from that perspective, but I think that's the biggest difference, that even though the games will be in Canada, in Vancouver and in Toronto, it'll be the country, right? It'll be the country that turns on to these games to watch our national team. Yeah, we cheer, maybe the gold medal game was maybe one of the only real national events in the Winter Olympics. because I'm not sure everybody was turning into some of the other events, maybe by chance. But, that was a national event because it was a golden amalgam of our sport.
Right.
Well, now it's our sport as well. And it's 3 group games, hopefully knockout games. And then there's other national teams that people have a link to, right? Like you said, my dad, my brother, my wife, somebody I work with, they're Brazilian, they're German, they're from, Colombia. So the whole world will be here. The whole world will be watching. And that just puts it on another scale. It just, and I honestly, even though I say people don't know what's coming, I think I don't know what's coming.
Yeah.
Because, obviously I've been in a lot of World Cups. I've been involved in World Cups in those rooms. Obviously I'm involved with this one and in those rooms. But I'm not sure I'm going to know the impact of my own country. That's, I think, the difference, right? I mean, I was, a very proud moment. First game against Belgium, Qatar, national anthem, very proud moment, right? But I'm in Qatar, all right? This is here. I'm not sure I'm even ready for that impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I get a little flutter thinking about that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
me too.
It's going to be great.
Yeah.
Hey, Vic, thanks for doing this.
Oh,
Real pleasure.
Anytime.
Yeah, I hope we see lots in the run up to World Cup. It's going to be, man, I can't wait.
Yeah, I mean, we start here, June 17th, Canada, Honduras, Gold Cup.
There we go.
Great match, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not like San Pedro Sula. Won't be like that at all.
No, it'll be a little cooler. Won't be as warm.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be a little bit more even. Although the team that lost that game was a good team. It just sometimes those things happen in football. We've come a long way from there.
We've come a long way from there. Yeah. Thanks, Vic.
Thank you, Stephen.